Welcome to this lovely afternoon at the Charleston Festival, and I'm particularly delighted to be able to introduce Sigrid Rausing, closest to me, Polly Toynbee in the middle, and Rachel Holmes at the end. Rachel Holmes, is a biographer and co-editor with Susie Orbach and Lisa Appignanesi of the recent 50 Shades of Feminism. Her current book, A Life of Eleanor Marx, the daughter of the father of communism, that's Eleanor, combined feminism with socialism. Unlike many suffragettes, she was a socialist. She was also a political activist and a translator of Ibsen and Flaubert. She was also very warm-hearted and ultimately had a tragic life. I feel her story could easily have been the subject of a 19th century French or Russian novel. Sigrid Rausing is the publisher and editor of Granta and Granta magazine. She's won several awards for her work in philanthropy and human rights. Her book, the book that she'll be talking about this afternoon, Everything is Wonderful, is a memoir of the year she spent in 1993 living on a collective farm in Estonia, which recreates a lost world as the villagers face the transition from impoverished communism to equally impoverished independence. At a point in time when Europe is once more in turmoil and arguments about individual and communal rights are again in the air, both books seem more relevant than might have been obvious at conception. There could be no better person to talk to them about their work than Polly Toynbee, long-standing Guardian columnist, former BBC social affairs editor, author, who has just written a new introduction to Bernard Shaw's The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism, Capitalism, Sovietism and Fascism. Okay? So I'm delighted to welcome all the speakers today and to hand over to Polly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Diana. We have two terrific books to talk about today. We're going to start by looking at Eleanor Marx. This is a wonderful biography about a rich life and the life of the background of the political times, not just of her father, but of herself, and of the amazing campaigns that she ran very successfully. But anyway, start off by telling us about her and her life and who she was.
Oh, thank you, Pauline. Great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. 1855, it's January, it's extremely cold, and Eleanor Marx is born to a down-and-out family in Dean Street, Soho. And she was the first and only Marx to be born in England and to be British and to have a British passport, indeed. And she had a father who was an impecunious political philosopher, and a mother who was a very interesting activist, and two elder sisters who were the only surviving girls, and a brother who was dying in the next room, Edgar. And he died of consumption, or TB actually, 6 weeks, the family disease, as Karl Marx, her father, Eleanor's father, called it, 6 weeks after she was born. And Marx quite clearly had really wanted to have a surviving son, transferred a lot of his energies and affections into this young girl who was homeschooled by him. And he was writing in the first 10 years of her life what he called she called, and Engels, his best friend, Friedrich Engels, called his great book. And his great book was a book that famously became Capital, or Das Kapital, and as he was working on it, she was literally sitting at the kitchen table with him, initially at Dean Street, and then later on they moved to Kentish Town into a slightly bigger house. There was a bit more money around, a few legacies from dead relatives and parents, and that Capital really shaped the first 10 years of her life, because when Marx was researching the data and looking at the history of England and looking at the history of economics and all sorts of different events, he would share those stories with her. And one of the things that really entertained me and I found really, really exciting when I was doing it. And my publisher from Bloomsbury is here today, and obviously it's a story that comes to mind in relation to what I called Karl Marx and the Philosopher's Stone, because that Marx did this very interesting version of Capital, which was called Hans Rockel. And Hans Rockel was this impecunious toy maker who made beautiful toys, but he kept having to sell them to the devil or pawn them. And then they'd go off on adventures, and sometimes they'd come back and not. But what he actually did, it was a sort of Harry Potter version of Capital. And there were all sorts of fairy stories built into it. But he explained to her through that the basic mechanisms of the operation of economics and ideas of equality and justice. And so Eleanor Marx grows up, and in 1883 she's finally without a mother, without an elder sister, and without her father. That's the year that he dies, and that becomes a really significant turning point in her life, because that's when the roof is lifted off the sky. She's no longer researching for him. She's no longer the amanuensis to her rather wonderful but needy, very dashing communard boyfriend Le Sagre, because of course she had to give her virginity to this dashing communard who'd been the last on the barricades, on the last barricade in the commune, with the last, with the bayonets when he ran out of bullets. And very, very interesting. And he compulsively wrote the history of the Paris Commune. And it is the book that gives us today that history very well. But Le Sagre was very traumatized, and he was also very broken up by the loss of idealism, the loss of the sort of ideology of what he thought would happen. But Eleanor worked on that, and she translated it. So that was one of her first books. And indeed, she got involved. Her first active engagement in politics when she was 16 was in the Paris Commune, and that was her first experience of being arrested and detained and interrogated. She goes on to become not Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, and not Tussi, which is her family name, the childhood name by which she was which she was known in the family and friends. But she goes on to become our mother, our old Stoker, and our old Stoker and our mother are figures who is one of the most important leaders and woman leaders of early British trade unionism. And famously, she's one of the leaders and organisers, and the primary organiser of the gas workers' strike, and 1889 to 1890, there's a series, the gas workers' strike, the Silvertown strikes, and she becomes a very, very important unionist and leader, and thank God her father wasn't still alive at that time, because he would have had some very, very strong views on the direction that her politics was taking. And then she with William Morris, simultaneously, as Polly mentioned, is centrally involved in the emergence of the building of a British parliamentary socialist Labour Party. And through its various different iterations, she is part of that. Why Eleanor Marx? Well, like all biographers' subjects, she just came up and tapped me on the shoulder, and I'm like, well, who are you? So I had to find out who she was. And I found out that I liked her more than I thought that I would. I mean, she was absolutely compelling. I was 2 years into writing a biography of somebody else when she came along, and I'm like, no. And she's like, yes. And I'm like, no. Yes. And it was irresistible. I had to. So I just one morning I woke up and I thought, I can't fight this anymore. Sorry, Conan Doyle, I'll come back to you. And I suppose, what was it? Well, what I discovered about her is that she was a Marx, but she was not a Marxist. And that interested me. And that was also related to the fact that her father was the theory, but she was the practice. Not the practice of his writing, but that she tested it. And that's where the connection between the idea of the sort of economics, the history, the socialism, if you like, the different versions of it, and the collision with feminism come, because the first thing that she comes up against is, wait a minute, where does that fit in? And of course, fortunately, she had Engels. And Engels' brilliant, Origins of Private Property, Family and the State, a book that as a young feminist had been, academic and student, had been really, really important to me, particularly in that moment where I suddenly understood what Engels was pointing out to us about the sexual division of labour being the prerequisite, the requirement to make a capitalist system function. And without that, it couldn't. And as I read on, and as I got to know Eleanor Marx 25 years later in my life, I suddenly realised that Engels was watching Eleanor when he was writing this book. And if you read about Eleanor and then you go back, I know Origins of Private Property, Family and the State might seem a bit dry, but if you look at, for example, excuse me, where Eleanor, where Engels says, in every revolution, in every sort of liberation ideology, or in any sort of notion of the idea of equality or socialism, this question of sexuality and sexual equality and sexual liberation comes up. And he's writing that at the time that Eleanor is experimenting with being in an open relationship with a married man and going on a double couples honeymoon with Olive Schreiner, the wonderful South African writer who was one of her best friends, well, was her best friend, and Havelock Ellis, who was Olive Schreiner's sort of, potential boyfriend at the time. So they go on this very interesting kind of bohemian double honeymoon. Not that Eleanor was a bohemian, but she hung out with bohemians. And so I suppose what comes down to us, and what I found absolutely so fascinating, is that Eleanor, for me, and she's Eleanor and she's Tussie, and she's our old Stoker and she's our mother, but she feels very, very modern. She's a social democrat. She has an understanding of social democracy, and then there's that particular moment, 1889, 1990, and she says, there've been the gas workers' strikes, and the engineers, and it's just been, there's been so much going on. And she stands up in Hyde Park, and as ever commands, an audience of, at that time, it was sort of 250,000 people moved through Hyde Park. She was absolutely amazing at that. It could move people to tears. But if you put her in a theatre in North London in Hampstead, because she had aspirations to be an actress, which was hilariously funny because she was really bad at it. And because she couldn't be anyone other than herself, and also she wanted the trouser rolls. She hadn't worked out that she couldn't be Macbeth and that she couldn't be Mark Antony. So she was rubbish. And it's quite hilarious. I mean, that was a really fun part of it. But she would become this kind of little mouse becoming something else. But if she had to stand up and orate, in front of the May Day demonstrations or rallies, and she could do it. And she said, we've been striking all year. We've gone on and on and on. What we're trying to fight for here is what we asked, what the resolution of the Second International was, and what was that? Why was it formed? What was the formation of the International on May Day about? An 8-hour working day. And we have struck, and we have been doing this, and now we need to get this passed into parliamentary law, and this needs to become a matter of representation. And that for me, is very much the centre of her legacy and what makes her fresh for us today. And then I think finally, it's good to hear her voice, perhaps. So some of her best friends were suffragettes, and I really do think that if she'd lived longer, she died in 1898 at the age of 43. If she'd lived longer, it would be very interesting to see how her relationship would have developed with the women's movement. So that's one thing. And then so she says, let's take a sip of water. I am, of course, as a socialist, not a representative of women's rights. It is the sex question and its economic base that I propose to discuss with you. The so-called women's rights question, which appears to be the only one you understand, is a bourgeois idea. I propose to deal with the sex question from the point of view of the working class and the class struggle. And there at the heart of it is Eleanor Marx saying that if we only fight for women's rights, and if we're not looking at the entire structure of how the logic of patriarchy works for men and women and employment and the home and childcare, we're never going to win these battles. And for me, that's been very interesting in taking stock of where feminism is now. And then finally, this is, and it's related to the feminism, and I think this is why Eleanor Marx was so important to me, that she is a revolutionary and she is a radical, but it's all about the family and home, and that's where it starts. You never find Eleanor Marx, like Marx and Engels, whenever something was happening, would say, you know, if there was some unrest going on, or there was trade, you know, the workers had struck somewhere, and there'd be, is it, you know, maybe the revolution's going to happen now. And Engels would write back from Manchester and say, no, 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 it's going to happen in 3 years' time. No, no, 3 months' time, there's definite signs of it. And I'm parodying it, but there was a kind of element, that there was a period that they went through, they really believed it would happen. You won't find that anywhere in Eleanor Marx, because she didn't believe in that kind of revolutionary transformation, except that it had to begin right at the heart of things. And this is actually her father, not her, but I think it tells us something about where she comes from. The modern family contains an embryo, not only slavery, servitus, but serfdom also. It contains within itself in miniature all the antagonisms which later develop on a wide scale within society and its state. And I think that that's where Eleanor Marx starts, and she understands about wonderful and enabling, but also oppressive patriarchal fathers and anxious mothers and constrained sisters. And she takes that and the learning of Capital, her father's great book, and Shakespeare, the family Bible, and she goes out to put it into practice. And I guess this is the story of what happens.
Thank you very much. Now, just in case anybody should get the idea that this is a rather dry, very theoretical political book, let's get to a bit of the low-down stuff too. Her older sister, they were a tragic family. Her older sister committed suicide. She was always thought to have committed suicide, but you suggest that you think she might have been murdered.
I do. That's a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read the book.
No, it's not. It's no, what will excite them. It's what will make them bite.
Yeah, I mean, so there are, I mean, it's very Chekhovian, isn't it? There are 3 sisters, and her elder sister dies, and her middle sister commits suicide. But I think because Eleanor Marx, I mean, there are 2 things that are generally known about her, if anybody's heard of her. You know, one is that she was one of Marx's daughters, and secondly, that she commits suicide. And I think only one of those is certain. And that became clear to me. The point about her other sister committing suicide, and I think it's a really important one, I want to clear up a bit, because I think that there's this sort of sense of, like, if there are other suicides, then it says something about the psychology of the family. Laura Lafargue and her husband, when they were, and I forget exactly, I think they were sort of, you know, in their early 70s. So not old by our standards now, but by the rock and roll of the lives that they lived. And, you know, not as good medicine, nutrition, and all that. They'd had their time, and everybody else had died. And they lived outside of Paris, and they went into Paris for tea, and they had their favourite cakes and their favourite coffee, and they came home, and they put their armchairs out on the lawn, and they, I think it was arsenic, and they commit suicide together. And they didn't have children. They had lost 7 children, and they had decided that that was how they wanted to go. So I kind of want to clarify on that point, because I don't think that there was any other tradition or psychology of suicide in the family. Yeah, I mean, the great part of the interesting part of Eleanor's relationship with the man who she wanted to marry, but who she couldn't because he was already married, so he said, and that his, you know, and he sort of omitted to mention that his wife had actually been dead for a few years, but she didn't know any of this because, you know, she loved him. Edward Aveling, an interesting secular socialist, one-time lover of Annie Besant. So there was a bit of a catfight between Annie Besant and Eleanor Marx for a while, which is very entertaining to read about. And then they kind of made up later around sort of feminist and women's emancipatory issues. But what I found going back to the archive, and this was the Institute of the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, where I spent a great deal of time. Absolutely fantastic archive. And that has changed since the last time Yvonne Kapp wrote her very brilliant 2-volume biography of Eleanor Marx in the 1970s. to which I'm very, very indebted. But what had changed since then is that post the end of the Cold War, the exchange of information and the opening up of the archive had refreshed what was, the material that was going between the two. And the Marxist-Leninist Institute in Moscow had exchanged a lot of papers with Amsterdam and vice versa. And so I thought it was worth having another look to see what might have filtered through. And I had looked at many different theories of suicide, and I'd thought about the suicide, and then I put it up against what was happening in her life. And in short, the last 14 months of Eleanor's life do not suggest that she was thinking about suicide. Quite the contrary. The evidence and the correspondence of the last few months of her life were that, having had this really miserable, tragic relationship with Edward Aveling, and now finally discovered that he really was actually, I'm going to use Tristram Hunt's words, an unmitigated shit. I had this great conversation with my editor, Bill Swainson at Bloomsbury, and I said, what am I going to do about Aveling? And he said, you're going to be objective, and you're going to be calm, and you're going to, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be objective and neutral, I'm going to look at him, and I'm working really hard at doing this. And then Tristram Hunt brings out The Frock-Coated Communist, his big book on Engels, and I go straight to Edward Aveling, and he introduces him, and he says, what can be said about Edward Aveling? Well, he was an unmitigated shit. So I rang up Bill, and I said, objectivity. But anyway, but I did want to sort of have a look at him from that point of view. But what was very clear is that she was beginning to feel guilty because Aveling appeared to be dying, and it looked like he was going, and she was beginning to realise that actually she could have a life without him. And she'd accepted all sorts of invitations to do things, and she had plans. That in itself is not evidence. I mean, a palimpsest can happen and people commit suicide, but it's quite clear that there was a shift in her sense of her independence. She had her home, the Den in Jews Walk in Sydenham. Yes, she was a property owner, and she loved that house. And there is a very interesting, I think the person who puts it best is Alvarez, where he talks about different sorts of, The Savage God. It's a really, really interesting book. I'm sure some of you come across it, about suicide and ideas of suicide and suicide in literature, and also examples from history. And he identifies, I think he formulates something very interesting, and he calls it murder by suicide. The idea that you can drive someone to such a psychological point and then put them in a position where everything's there. And if you're asking me, did Edward Aveling kill her or not? Well, let's put it this way. As soon as she died the next day, all her family and friends were absolutely convinced that he'd murdered her, and they wanted to bring a criminal trial. And if Edward Aveling hadn't died 3 months later, they would have done. And I found a letter by Gertrude Gentry, who was Eleanor's housekeeper, the first servant she ever had. She became her housekeeper. She said, throw out all those horrible clothes and buy some decent stuff from a catalogue and, get yourself together. And Gertie and Eleanor became very close friends. And the reason I took you on that ramble around the exchange of archival documents between Moscow and Amsterdam is that there were some unarchived letters. And I found 2 letters written in the hand of Gertrude Gentry, who Eleanor Marx had taught to read and write, as she helped so many unionists, including Will Thorne, who, as you know, was the first leader of the Trade Union Congress, and who in his memoir said, Eleanor Marx taught me to read and write and do accounts. And she did that tirelessly for many people and never spoke of it. She taught Gertie to write, and I found a letter that Gertrude had written to Edith Lanchester, who, believe it or not, was Eleanor Marx's secretary, so there's a whole other story there. And in that letter, Gertie is clearly reaching out and trying to say something about Aveling's behaviour. But she was the servant, and nobody listened. But I think the evidence is there. And Olive Schreiner, Eleanor's best friend, who was in South Africa, partly because she just couldn't bear, she'd gone away because she just couldn't bear to see what was happening. And Olive wrote from South Africa and said, were I in England, I would go straight to Gertrude Gentry. I would go straight to her servant and find out what happened, because she would know.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a terrific read. Now, we're going to talk about Sigrid's wonderful book, It's an ironic title, I think you could say. Everything is wonderful. It's a marvelous evocation of a time of extraordinary change amongst a generation of people in Estonia who had lived through amazing times, 2 world wars, Nazi occupation, Soviet occupation, and then sudden chaotic liberation into a market economy, each of those causing them appalling turmoil. And you describe it very beautifully. You describe the people very beautifully, and also the landscape and the life of the soil of people with absolutely nothing, of Swedish ancestry. And you were there to do a PhD on exactly that time. It was one of those pivotal moments in history. So perhaps tell us a bit more about what it was that drew you there and what it was that you found and how they were living. And it was it's a mixture of a work of anthropology and a personal journal of your year there.
So I was working on a PhD in the anthropology department at UCL, and 1989 happened. I was going to be working on Melanesian law, systems of law. And I became very interested in the field of post-Soviet anthropology, which was a tiny... Can you hear me?
I'll tell you what, let's try and have you... Can you bear to hold it?
No, yes, I can.
Can you hold it?
Can you hear me better now?
No, it's not working. The answer is it's not working. I'll tell you what, take mine. It's just turned on. All right.
Can you hear me now?
No. Talk right into it. Put it up close.
I will.
That's it.
Right. So I was in the anthropology department, became interested in post-Soviet anthropology, which then was a tiny field. And in anthropology, the study is always on a micro level. So I found a minority of Swedes living in Estonia, and I decided to study them. And I turned up first in 1991, came to the collective farm, which was like small collective farms all over. It was in a border protection zone, which meant that it was manned by Soviet soldiers. You needed permission to go there. It was a square with some rusty workshops, a school, a culture house, and a collection of concrete blocks of flats behind an old manor house. So it was a very desolate place, but also a compelling one, a region that had been affected by all the major events of the 20th century. So they'd been through the first Russian Revolution in 1905, the First World War, then the Russian Revolution, the battle for independence. The Soviet Union didn't give independence to the countries that wished for it after the First World War, but they fought for it, some successfully, others not successfully. So from 1920, Estonia was independent. Then in 1934, there was a coup d'etat, authoritarian coup d'etat. Then the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act, and eventually the Soviet invasion, the deportations associated with that, then the Nazi invasion, 4 years of Nazi occupation, Holocaust unleashed on Estonia. Many Jewish people were brought to Estonia to be killed in camps that we know very little about still. And then the Soviet forces coming back in 1944. I knew almost nothing about the Estonian Swedes because they had been evacuated by the SS in 1944, following a secret deal between the Swedish government and the SS, probably via a person called Kleist, who negotiated directly with Hitler. So 7,000 people out of a minority of 8,000 people, which sounds like small numbers, but in Estonian terms, it was Estonia's third biggest minority, were evacuated. 1,000 people remained behind for various reasons. When the Estonian Swedes came to Sweden, they were told to never speak about the evacuation because it was obviously very tainting. And so the history of these minority Swedes had kind of been forgotten in Sweden. I grew up knowing something about the Estonian refugees in Sweden, but not really anything about the Estonian Swedes. I didn't know there was such a minority. After 1989, people started coming back. I mean, the former exiles started coming back to visit their former homes. So this was my field site. I was there for a year. I taught English in the school. I taught a bit of French. I was living and working with people. I interviewed everybody who lived in the village and got to know quite well a few of the elderly people who were still Swedish, who lived still on the old farmhouses where they had grown up. And I met them often with their Swedish relatives who'd grown up in Sweden. And that was a very poignant experience because growing up in a welfare state like Sweden makes for good height, good teeth. You know, the people looked so well and so confident compared to the people who'd been left behind in Estonia, who were, on average, several inches shorter and looked at least 10 years older. And so what I was particularly interested in was how this remote people and this abandoned area, which had been, you know, particularly isolated because it was part of a border protection zone, how the people in these villages, all part of the collective farm. The collective farm started out in 1949 when they collectivized. There were a number of collective farms on the peninsula. They all amalgamated one by one, and eventually only Lenin was left, which of course makes sense. I wanted to find out what they remembered and what they knew of the history of the 20th century. And the answer was, in the context of the Soviet censorship of history and suppression of history, the answer was that they knew very little. The old people remembered a little bit. Middle-aged people knew virtually nothing about the thriving, independent system of, the rural economy and independent culture of Estonia between the wars. All that had been lost. There were only some fragments of it left. I quote from Orwell, 1984, in my book, who, you'll probably all remember this, Winston the hero.
Sorry.
Winston the hero goes to visit some proles, quote unquote, in a pub to ask them the question of whether life was better before or after the revolution. And what he finds is that they can't even answer the question. They only remember stray memories, a lost bicycle, swirl of dust on a hot day, because they've lost the entire system of history that would help them to remember. And in the Soviet Union, similarly, and particularly, I think, in the Baltic states, where the entire intelligentsia was decimated during the war and in the first Soviet invasion, but also the Nazi invasion and the second Soviet invasion. So, you know, the Nazis also destroyed books. The Nazis also killed people. So the bit of intelligentsia that was left in Russia itself, in the context of the Baltic states, was gone. You know, everybody who was involved in any intellectual pursuit pretty much had either become a conformist or disappeared by 1944, 45. There was nobody left. And so there was no structure left of the description of history, history writing, to hang people's memories on. We often don't remember or realize how much we need that structure of history to hang our own memories on, you know, so that when all that is gone, there's really nothing much left. I think I might leave it at that.
Tell me what they were left believing. What did they feel about the society that, you know, they'd lost the communal, the farm, and a market was coming in that actually destroyed what little they have because all their savings went when the currency was changed. What were they left believing about what kind of community they should live in?
When I was there, the year I was there, 93, 94, the kind of independence fervor was really gone, and that was the harshest austerity era of the former Soviet Union. So that was Jeff Sachs' austerity policies that were imposed on really the whole of the Soviet Union. And the effects of those policies were beyond anything we've seen in the last 2 years in places like Greece. I mean, it was poverty beyond anything people remember in Europe. You know, people literally had very little to eat. They had almost no heating.
You lived for a whole year without heating.
Well, I had an electric radiator, like many people had. And, you know, the temperatures went down to minus 33 degrees, so we wouldn't have survived without any heating. But it was very, very cold. But for those reasons, people on the whole, and I did a survey of the whole community, felt nostalgic and regretful of the collective farm because they had lost a lot. You know, they'd lost the dining room, they'd lost the creche, they'd lost the childcare they took for granted, they'd lost the, you know, the welfare state such as it was, you know, and it was not a good welfare state. But nevertheless, you know, it was gone, you know, and everything was in disarray. You know, vaccinations, dental care, nothing was really working anymore. So of course people were feeling regretful of the collective farm. On the other hand, they also longed for what they called the normal, and that concept meant the West, and specifically Sweden and Finland, which were the countries that Estonians identified with. And they knew Sweden and Finland. They knew how, you know, they knew about the welfare in Sweden and Finland, and that was the normal. They knew that Estonia was not normal. They talked about that a lot. And they had some hope. But, you know, what I say in the book is they couldn't have known then how quickly Estonia would recover, because Estonia really did recover quite quickly.
Well, let's wind this out a bit to talk about ideologies and how people live with them and changing ideologies. You talked a bit about Eleanor Marx, you know, brought up with her father's ideas of communism and herself in the commune. I mean, at that point, would she have seen herself as a communist at that stage? Did the sort of social democratic ideas come after that? What was her state of mind when she was a communard?
Don't think she ever saw herself as a communist. She came from, certainly there were a lot of collectivist ideas around the background that she came from, and from a very English tradition, you know, right back to sort of, you know, ranters and levellers and so on. And I think there's a sleight of hand in history which I'm really interested in, that was really interesting for me in the book, because something happens after, well, really after the assassination of Trotsky in 1940 and then Stalin's corruption, that when we look back on this history, it's hard to look back behind that because it appears to be associated. And there's a quote that always, or there's a moment that always sticks with me. Excuse me. And I think it was about 1893. Eleanor Marx went to speak to the Socialist Society of Aberdeen, and she gave 2 lectures, and after the end of the second lecture, a chap who identified himself as a Marxist, whatever that was, she thought, stood up and set her right on a few things and explained to her the communistic and Marxist ideas of her father, and she listened very patiently, and she, and then she said, "Heaven save Karl Marx from his friends." And there's nothing in Eleanor's lived history, because she wasn't an ideologue. I mean, insofar as that question of ideology that you put to both of us, I mean, she's very much about lived practice. But insofar as she has an ideology, she believes in the principle of equality, and that's the fundamental. And that's economic equality, and it's gender equality. And I think we would recognise her now more in terms of post-war ideas around human rights and the protection and regulation of human rights. And so there's no sense in which she ever, as an individual or the people around her, I mean, she's organising as a socialist in the Social Democratic Federation.
And in the parliamentary tradition.
In the parliamentary tradition, and
Yes.
what becomes the ILP. So she's a socialist parliamentarian who would have recognised the birth of the welfare state, and who was vehemently opposed to any sort of forms of sort of rigid ideology.
What do you think? I don't know if have you ever been back there again to talk to those people again? Have you ever been back to Estonia?
Yeah,
because I wonder how they then developed later, when everything became very successful under a more market economy. Did they still look back to a time of a greater welfare state, or did they then embrace the market economy?
I think that they largely embraced it, but I can't say that view is based on any academic study. So that's my impression. I had recently 3 people from the Collective Farm wrote to me about the book because it was published in Estonia as well. And what they said was that they were very happy to have had a witness from that time, because they were beginning to forget even themselves. They all said this in different ways. They were beginning to forget just how harsh it had been, and they felt it was important to remember that, to remember those times.
Right. Now, before I open it out for you to ask questions, make comments, let me just ask you, do you think that we are living now in a quite ideological age or not? How would you define the state of politics now?
I think we're living in quite a pragmatic age, actually, and I think that's a very good thing on the whole. I think the great ideologies are gone. I think that's a good thing, because on the whole the great ideologies led to extraordinary hardships around the world. I think the church is the one great ideology, if you can call it that, that's still here with us. So I think a more pragmatic era, an era where everything is loosening up a little bit and new coalitions are forming, is quite an interesting time.
What would you say to that?
I think I feel differently to Sigrid. I think that there's some broad scale ideologies which still seem to be very deeply embedded. And I think... Is that me?
No, I'm not sure. I think it's okay.
Is that all right? Oh, there. The fat controller, huh? That's what you get if you put it in your bum pocket. How's that? I'm actually thinking about a really interesting article that Polly wrote about the state of our electoral democracy. Can I keep it local? Keep it
local.
In Britain. And I must admit, when I got to your constipated rabbits, myself and the shade of Eleanor Marx laughed out loud. She would have liked that. But I think there's a point that you make in there, Polly, about a need for greater imaginative interventions in politics and leadership. Actually, I think there's a difference between ideology and ideologues and interesting and imaginative leadership and politicians. And I think in an immediate environment, that's something that we lack. And I actually feel that all of our politicians across parties at the moment actually seem to be functions of different kinds of ideologies, some of them that seem quite residual, to be honest, rather than interesting, imaginative innovators. And there does seem to also be a willful denial of confronting the fact that our resources are not illimitable. So this kind of illusion, and this is what I think the great ideology for me is this illusion of capitalism, and I don't equate the two. Capitalism and free market economy is not the same thing at all, but this kind of sense that it can all keep going. Well, it'll all keep going until it runs out. And right. So that's, I think we are labouring under it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right, now, anybody, what have we got? Have we got 2 microphones? We have. Right. Would anybody like to contribute to this discussion? There's one person over there. Is there somebody next who wants to come over anyone on this side? There's somebody there, we'll take second.
Is it working? Yeah. Hello, question for Sigrid about... Hello, I'm here. Hello, question for Sigrid. I'm interested about if you've been back to Estonia more recently and kind of what's going on there, because I don't think we really know much about Estonia at all, I don't. And if there's any kind of unrest or concern in those sorts of countries with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and Russia sort of threatening peace and whatever again. I just don't know if you've got any more sort of insights of recently.
Yeah, I mean, there's NATO troops in Estonia now, and people are very nervous. And there was a big cyber attack from Russia on Estonia a few years ago. You probably remember that. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that, Putin's generation too was of the generation of the suppression of history, the censorship of history. And so, that's why it makes sense for Russia now to talk about the anti-fascist struggle in Ukraine. It doesn't make any sense if you know anything about history, but, the anti-fascist struggle will always be an emotional one for Russians, which is why it's such a dangerous situation, because all that propaganda over the years feeds into what is happening now in Ukraine.
Do you mean because that's the only history they've ever been taught, was the gallant struggle against fascism, and there is no other form of enemy, no other form of history or politics?
Well, I mean, Putin is famously interested in history, so I think he himself is, has other views, but people on the whole still, the idea of the anti-fascist struggle really resonates with Russians generally. And so any enemy of Russia will always be a fascist. In the Ukrainian Western-looking people see the struggle as one of, the democratic values of the West, the democratic values of the EU, versus the authoritarianism of Putin's Russia, versus Putin's suggested Eurasian Union. So it's 2 completely different mindsets, clashing.
Thank you. Over here.
Hello. Good evening. Do you think there's a danger of making Eleanor a more of a romantic figure with an idealised idea of communism compared to Sigrid's experience in Estonia where communism doesn't work? So that book is making a sort of glamorous, romantic version of communism. Do you think that could be a danger?
Well, I don't think so, because Eleanor Marx was not a communist. And that was not her the context of her political engagement at all. She wasn't a communist, and she wasn't the leader of some revolutionary movement that wished to...
Was she promoting it?
No, not at all. She was a trade unionist. She was an organiser. She was a translator. She was a teacher. She was very, very committed to feminism, to trying to work out economic inequalities both in the workplace and the home. You know, in terms of how she saw feminism, was not just about rights for women, it was about rights for everybody. I mean, you know, that the problem with the structure of labour was that, as is the case now, and this is part of something that we can still see in debates around feminism, and some people are talking about feminist backlash, is that women's wages undercut men's wages. That was happening then, and it's still happening now. Divide and rule within the workplace, but also makes these things possible. And then, of course, in those times, child labour was then used to undercut the women's wages once again. Now we have that, of course, on a global scale, that we, you know, all sit here, God help us, you know, in things that are produced by child labour. So, but I think that that was certainly not my understanding of her. My understanding of Eleanor Marx is that she's, and my experience of living with her for a decade, is that she's someone who comes out of the experience of her parents in the failed 1848 bourgeois revolutions, which are very relevant to us now. I mean, if Eleanor Marx had seen what had been happening in Egypt, she'd go like, well, go figure. You know, Dad and Frederick saw this in 1848. That's how they ended up being exiles in England. And so she's the child of people who have already moved beyond an idealistic social...
But you said something interesting earlier when you were talking about this. You said her father would have been horrified if she'd seen to the extent to which she went down the parliamentary route and realised that you do reforms through democracy, through parliament, through winning the 8-hour day, through winning the things that she fought through trade unionism, but the parliamentary route. She wasn't, and he would have been appalled by that because he was still essentially believed that the revolutionary route was the only way to go.
I think he still believed that a radical break, yes, that had to be, there had to be an intervention, a radical break that we would recognise as a moment of saying, no, this has to stop like here, and that would supersede the rule of law. Yeah, and the organisation of those infrastructures of society. By the time that Eleanor Marx is an adult, there is no point at which she says we don't respect the rule of law and we don't want to get men. And of course, I think this is a really important point in response to your question, is that remember that Eleanor Marx is living in a time where working class men do not have the vote. It's only in 1918, more than 2 decades after she's died, or been murdered, or commit suicide, that, you know, there is universal suffrage, you know, for men, and, you know, mostly over, you know, all men over 21, regardless of class and religion, and women over 30, God help us. But so I think that there is absolutely, in answer to your question, Polly, there's definitely a difference between them.
difference, yeah.
But my other answer would be, you know, if you get time in the summer, read the book and tell me.
Of course. And maybe you don't draw a very clear distinction between social democracy and communism. Maybe it's all of a rainbow to you. I thought so. Right. Anybody else want to come in at this point? There's somebody right there in the middle.
We've had a really interesting picture of Eleanor as the kind of pragmatic woman against her father, not against, but contrasted with her father, the ideologue, the leader and the visionary. I wondered whether Sigrid, in her work in Estonia, noticed a similar kind or any kind of difference between the way women there in the collective farm occupied a place that was similar, i.e. could you see that the men were actually making the rules and thinking of the ideas and the women were just making it work? Or would that be quite fanciful?
That is such an interesting question. I mean, in fact, I was struck when I was there by what a very gender equal society it was. You know, the structures of power that were left in the village was basically the mayor, who was a new liberal, and the headmistress of the school, who was married to the former boss of the collective farm.
they were quite discredited, and there were a lot of rumors of corruption that still clung to them, you know, trips to Florida, mink coats, that kind of thing. There was absolutely no sense that the mayor, had more power than the headmistress of the school, you know, and there was no such distinction. And in that sense, you know, perhaps, you know, that was a successful aspect of the Soviet ideology. I remember looking at some old women's magazines from the old time, in black and white, and they were all the women, you know, going off to their women's conferences and looking very serious, and there was something rather nice about that, I have to say. But of course, the other side of that question is that women famously had to work much harder than men in the Soviet Union, you know, because they largely worked in the workplace, but they also mostly took care of the home. Grandparents mainly took care of the children. That wasn't the case so much in Estonia, but certainly that was the case in Russia. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much indeed. And unless anybody's got anything desperately pressing, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. So I would just like to say thank you very much to both of you. Very different books, both of them absolutely riveting reads, and both of them about ideas that I think are very resonant with where we are now. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. That really was a fascinating session. What came over to me was the extent of identification you both had with your subject. Rachel, you with Eleanor Marx, and Sigrid with the community amongst which you lived for a year. And I think that made it a sort of a very profound and very thought-provoking session. So thank you very much, and thank you so much, Polly, for guiding us through. If I could ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just to remain sitting for a moment while we take Rachel, Polly and Sigrid back to the bookstall where you can meet them again, and we can give them a drink. For those of you who don't yet know, just a couple of other announcements. I think we have some raffle tickets on behalf of Charleston on sale in the marquee, as well as books. Carol Ann Duffy, the Poet Laureate, wrote a poem specially to mark the 25th anniversary of the Charleston Festival that we've reprinted, hand-printed form in a limited edition that will only be sold at Charleston. Half of them are already gone, so take your opportunity if you're interested. I think on sale at the same table as the raffle tickets. But once more, I'd like to say thank you to Sigrid, Polly and to Rachel.